Welcome, Vintage Hollywood Archive. Sex and power have always been intertwined, especially, it seems, in the entertainment industry. Howard Hughes, a famous pilot, businessman, and film director, was as notorious for this as anyone else. What are the details of Hughes' relationship with actress Ginger Rogers? Why was Ginger Rogers spied on and monitored by Howard Hughes? Make sure to watch the video until the end and leave your thoughts in the comments. If you are new here, join our wonderful community by subscribing to the Vintage Hollywood Archive channel. Ginger Rogers' affair with Howard Hughes was far from a storybook romance. Ginger Rogers, born July 16, 1911, 4 years to the day after fellow legend Barbara Stanwyck. Wholesome but sexy, forthright and vulnerable, honest and energetic, Ginger Rogers was one of Hollywood's brightest stars of the 30s and 40s. Not a great actress, as she was always the first to admit she could handle both comedy and drama capably, as well as sing and dance. And if her range was not as great as some of her contemporaries, her appeal and glamour were more down to earth than other screen heroines, and thus easier to identify with. Also in the cast of our tale is someone intimately involved with Carole Lombard. In fact, it's believed he deflowered her in the late 1920s. We are, of course, referring to the billionaire slash aviator slash inventor slash producer slash director and all-round eccentric Howard Hughes. Depending on whom you listen to, Hughes was a villain, a genius, a madman, sometimes all three simultaneously. Hughes romanced, promoted, and/or bedded many of Hollywood's most legendary leading ladies. And while his relationship with Lombard was both clandestine and brief, he was far more open about being seen with Rogers. In fact, they had known each other since the early 1930s. Here they are at the Hollywood premiere of Ginger's film 42nd Street in 1933. The late 30s were good times for both Howard and Ginger. Rogers was riding high as RKO's meal ticket, both on her own and as a leading lady for Fred Astaire. Hughes broke the transcontinental airspeed record in January of 1937, and the following year received a New York ticker tape parade for a record-breaking global flight. Hughes, who earlier had been in a long relationship with Katharine Hepburn, now eyed her stage door co-star. He started seriously courting Rogers, recently divorced from her second husband, actor Lou Ayres, through her mother Layla. That October, Howard proposed to Ginger, and she accepted, receiving a 5-carat, square-cut emerald Cartier engagement ring. What do you say to that? With wounds still fresh from her last broken marriage, Rogers said she wasn't ready. According to Rogers, Hughes and she continued to date sporadically, but she wasn't exactly waiting by the phone. For the next 3+ years, Hughes would be involved with Hepburn and others, and Rogers had a full dance card as well. This first marriage proposal to Rogers came right after Rogers and her on-screen dance partner Fred Astaire finished shooting their masterpiece, Swing Time, directed by George Stevens. Rogers and Stevens fell in love on the set of Swing Time and carried on a relationship for 3 years. 3 years that encompassed Hughes' romance with Hepburn and fell roughly into the midpoint of Stevens' 17-year marriage to former silent star Yvonne Howell. And then, in 1939, after his flight around the world and the fizzling of his affair with Bette Davis, Howard came back into Ginger's life with a vengeance. By early 1940, he had finally convinced her to allow his attorney Neil McCarthy to handle her divorce from heirs. Once the papers were filed, Rogers recalled, "Howard completely dominated my personal life." A woman who believed in the ritual of marriage and all it symbolized, Ginger continued to live with her mother Leela after accepting Howard's proposal. Hughes still had the mansion on Muirfield Road, and in 1940, in need of temporary lodgings during the Philadelphia story shoot, Hepburn moved back in, but they did not rekindle their romance. Hughes was working hard to convince Rogers, who had bested Hepburn in the Battle of the RKO Divas, that she was the woman he wanted to live with. Rogers asked Edith Head, designing at RKO's neighbor Paramount, to create a wedding gown. Hughes bought a tract of land at Cahooga Park near the Hollywoodland, now Hollywood sign, where he reportedly planned to build a mansion for himself and Rogers. Hughes had purchased 138 acres west of the Hollywood sign, and he explained to Ginger that he was going to build a house there just for her. His intention after their marriage was to build a castle with sweeping views of Los Angeles and the San Fernando Valley. "He knew I loved a view," she recalled. "My own home had a very lovely view, and this was much higher than the house I had, so he thought that would be very appealing to me, and to some extent it was." In order to do so, he would need a road as well as utilities, electricity, gas, and water, where none existed. When the city tried to prevent him from building a road, Hughes sued and won. While Rogers was imagining life with Howard Hughes in a custom-built castle in the sky, her career was at a crossroads. She and Astaire had recently made what she believed would be their final film together, the musical biopic The Story of Irene and Vernon Castle. Rogers had been RKO's top female star for much of the 30s, but the studio had battled with her over contracts and struggled to figure out what to do with her in between Astaire musicals. The devoutly religious Rogers also had firm ideas about what she should be representing on screen, and she fought back against some of the material RKO tried to cast her in. Meanwhile, Ginger Rogers was having second thoughts about the marriage. She no doubt had encountered Hughes' eccentricities, his paranoia, which was exacerbated by his use of painkillers, and by his deafness, which he refused to acknowledge or treat, and a severe case of obsessive-compulsive disorder, which manifested itself in germ phobia and the compulsion to do things like sort and count the peas on his plate. She confided to friends that she feared he would hold her prisoner on their Cahuenga Peak estate. Then Rogers was courted by producer David Hempstead to star in an adaptation of a popular novel called Kitty Foyle, about an independent young woman who becomes pregnant and has an abortion. One night, while Howard was driving her to dinner, Ginger started flipping through a copy of the novel that Hempstead had sent her. Somehow, she flipped straight to the scenes in the book that were the least likely to pass the production code in a film adaptation. Not just the abortion, which Rogers found repugnant, but also what censor-in-chief Joseph Breen would call, quote, "the suggestion of frequent illicit sex affairs between your two leads," end quote. Ginger threw the book down in disgust, telling Hughes she was not flattered that Hempstead and RKO had bought this highly suggestive and too lurid novel expressly with her in mind. Ginger's mother advised her that there was no way the things that she objected to in Kitty Foyle could ever make it into a Hollywood movie. Kitty Foyle would have to be sanitized for the screen, and with a millionaire fiancé promising her the world, or at least a house with a view of the world as Hollywood knew it, Ginger could afford to wait. Except increasingly, it felt like Ginger Rogers' time was not her own. At first, Howard would call Layla directly to schedule and plan his dates with Ginger. As they became more seriously involved, Hughes stopped asking either of the Rogers women for their permission and started directly ordering Ginger to make sure he was the sole focus of her attention. She had begun to suspect that he was having her followed and that her phone calls were being surveilled. Years later, Hughes had kept tabs on Billy Dove by physically standing outside public restrooms to make sure he didn't lose her when she emerged. Ginger's instinct that he had tapped her phones, if accurate, would have been the first indication that Hughes had begun to outsource the activity of monitoring his girlfriends to a network of aides and spies. That network would become visible all soon enough. After his experience with Katharine Hepburn, Hughes may have feared once again being shut out of a complicated family dynamic. Rogers didn't come from a long, storied line like Hepburn, but that made her bond with Layla Rogers all the stronger. Ginger believed that her mother was the only person who always had her best interests at heart. Once Hughes angrily started trying to regulate the frequency with which she spoke to Layla, Ginger's increasingly bad feeling about the relationship began to crowd out her hopes for a blue sky future. This was too much for me, she thought. Finally, one night in 1940, Howard called Ginger at home. He had a dentist appointment the next morning and wanted Ginger to go with him. Ginger refused. All well and good, except there was another woman involved. The catalyst of their breakup, however, was Hughes' usual pattern of wildly indiscreet infidelity. These days, people best know Gloria Vanderbilt for her designer jeans of the late 1970s or as the mother of newscaster Anderson Cooper. In 1940, she was a 16-year-old heiress who Hughes took a liking to and began courting her. How did this Lothario manage to juggle the trio? He installed 3 telephone lines in his home and gave each woman a separate number. Moreover, his personal secretary made sure any liaisons were kept considerably separate. Vanderbilt dropped out of the running first, falling for Playboy Pat DeChico. That left Rogers and Domergue. Ginger was beginning to have second thoughts about Howard, who tried to take control over her personal and professional career. Eventually, she learned the truth from writer Alden Nash. He made her aware that Hughes had regularly visited Domergue's residence, which just happened to be across the street from where he lived. Nash told Ginger that he had seen Hughes' car parked in front of the home of another actress, not just that night, but many nights. To say that Rogers was livid would be an understatement. The sound that came from Ginger's room rocked the Rogers house to the point that Layla ran shrieking through the door, certain her daughter was being attacked. Scarves, bras, and panties flew as Ginger rummaged through her doors, removing any item that Hughes had ever given her. Dumping them all in a brown bag, including several necklaces, a ruby bracelet, and the emerald engagement ring, Ginger busied herself writing a farewell note. When Howard called the next morning to once again try to get Ginger to accompany him to the dentist, she again refused. She spent the day packing up all the jewelry. A few hours later, she got a call from Noah Dietrich. Howard was in the hospital, Dietrich told her. Would she come see him? Hughes had been injured in an automobile accident. Driving to the dentist, Hughes had smashed head-on into another car. Another crash meant another head injury. This time, it had taken 70 stitches to close up Howard's eye. Rogers immediately went to Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital. Hughes was in the recovery room, his head wrapped up like a mummy. "How are you feeling?" Ginger asked. "Miserable," he responded, and proceeded to explain that this was her fault. He had been so mad that Ginger refused to accompany him to the dentist, he told her that he had driven straight into oncoming traffic. By now, Ginger was used to Hughes' patterns of manipulation. Already aware that he was cheating, she wasn't going to let him gaslight her anymore. She told him what she had found out about where he was spending his nights and with whom. Before the sedated cad could conjure up a response, Ginger produced the box full of jewelry. The engagement, she told him, was over. She pushed the bag into his chest and sternly said, "Faith Domergue needs these more than I do." Ginger quickly turned and left, slamming the door behind her. There was a long silence you could cut with a knife, Rogers recalled. Howard looked at me from under his bandages. His soulful eyes were like those of a bloodhound puppy. Then I turned and walked toward the door. With a dramatic turn of the head, I opened the door, slamming it as I left. That was the last time I ever saw Howard. Dietrich soon entered the hospital room and found Hughes in tears over the breakup. It was, Dietrich wrote, the only time anyone saw Howard Hughes cry. The next morning, a station wagon Howard had given her was missing from her garage. She reported it as stolen, only to learn it was the property of Hughes Tool Company and had been repossessed. Lombard once told actress Miriam Hopkins that Hughes, who was dating Rogers at an event both attended, has got Clark Gable beat by 4 inches, but Hughes has no soul. Both Ginger and Carol could probably vouch for Howard's soullessness. After Rogers' departure, Hughes abandoned the Cahuenga Peak project, but not the property, probably because he had more pressing concerns. The 1940s were arguably his busiest decade. In addition to running Hughes Aircraft and developing new civil and military planes, he continued a parallel Hollywood career, producing movies with Preston Sturges and buying a studio, RKO, in 1948. He was awarded a Congressional Medal for his aviation work in 1941 and received a contract to produce his giant military transport plane, the Spruce Goose, in 1942. He also had 2 nervous breakdowns, the first in 1944 and the second in which he locked himself in a screening room for 4 months while subsisting on chocolate bars, milk, and movies in 1947. In addition to his emotional injuries, there were devastating physical ones. In 1946, Hughes suffered major trauma when the XF-11 reconnaissance plane he was test piloting developed engine failure. His attempt to crash land on the Los Angeles Country Club golf course failed, setting fire to and destroying 2 houses. It was his second near-fatal plane crash and would leave him in severe, permanent pain. Addicted to codeine and increasingly crippled by OCD, Hughes withdrew from public life in 1950, though he continued to run his business by phone. When he died of renal failure in 1976, Hughes' 6'4" frame was so wasted by malnutrition that he weighed 90 pounds. Coroners found pieces of hypodermic needles in his arms. He left a mismanaged estate whose value, once estimated at $2 billion, was pegged at $360 million. The parcel on Cahuenga Peak was a tiny part of a fortune that included Hughes Aerospace, the Howard Hughes Medical Center, 4 hotels, and 6 casinos. Ginger Rogers didn't win Howard Hughes and his multi-millions, but in the spring of 1941, she won an Academy Award as Best Actress for Kitty Foyle. And that's a trade-off any actress would make. There are not enough words to adequately describe the joy Ginger Rogers had brought to the world. There is hardly anyone over the age of 20 in any country of the world who has not been charmed, dazzled, and captivated by the extraordinary and diverse talents of this enchanting woman. She was 83 when she died at her home in Rancho Mirage near Palm Springs, apparently of natural causes. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you are new here.